Towards the end of the year, I always get very jealous of everyone posting their top 10 games of the year videos, mainly because I don't often get to play video games in the year that they get released, and I usually enjoy playing older video games anyway, but this year I thought I'd do top 10 video games I've played this year rather than ones that have been released, so hope you enjoy it. So I'm doing these in order of how much the game impressed me, and starting off we have Seasons After Fall. This is a puzzle platforming game with an absolutely gorgeous art style. A lot of the fun gameplay comes from manipulating the seasons, which in turn changes the environment around you, allowing you to access new areas, Metroidvania style. While the controls can be a little frustrating sometimes, and there's a lot of quite boring backtracking to be done in this game, it did manage to keep my attention till the end, because it has a very minimalist but interesting story which can be quite a tearjerker at times. If you're a fan of Ori and the Blind Forest, you should definitely check this out, because although it doesn't quite reach the heights of Ori, it's definitely a very similar game. Next up is Owlboy. This is a retro-inspired side-scrolling shoot-'em-up with an intriguing twist that the main character you control cannot actually shoot, but he can carry other characters that can shoot, and depending on which character you're carrying, can shoot different styles of weapons, different bullets, that kind of thing. Again, this has a few interesting Metroidvania style puzzles with backtracking, that kind of thing. A very vibrant, steampunky kind of world with a very interesting lore. Owlboy certainly achieved everything it set out to do, and it definitely reminded me a lot of some SNES classics like Actraiser and Demon's Crest. Number 8 on the list is Furi, which has a very cool cel-shaded art style. It's a boss rush game with really tight combat mechanics, which not a lot of these types of games have. In fact, I would say that usually you would only find this kind of complexity in a multiplayer game or, general fighting games like Street Fighter with frame-specific movements and that kind of thing. So yeah, these bosses are incredibly fun. They're all wildly different in terms of the gameplay and also the designs of the bosses, which can be very creepy sometimes. It's very challenging. In fact, it's one of the most challenging games I've ever played. But it's also really fair. It gives you a really good chance to make a comeback if you're caught on the ropes by a particular boss. And that sense of satisfaction you get when you finally do beat a really tough boss is just great here. The soundtrack to this game complements the gameplay perfectly. It has this kind of shifting electro sort of style that moves along with the different phases of all the fights. It's really good. If you're a fan of action games, boss rush games, and like a bit of a challenge, then this should be very, very high on your list of what's next to play. Number 7 is Stellaris. Now, I can't really say a lot about this game because I'm still really learning the ins and outs of it. It's a very complex, space-themed 4X real-time strategy. And what I like about real-time strategy games, or the ones that I like, are very, very slow-paced real-time strategies, and this one is probably the slowest pace that I've ever played. I've been looking for a game like this for a long time. I tried Endless Space, but found it to be just far too complex and not a very good tutorial. But Stellaris has a phenomenal tutorial that takes you through step by step in a real match. It's got all the options you might expect from this kind of 4X game, diplomacy, combat, that kind of thing. It's all about exploring, dominating space, different planets of different types. The UI is a lot more coherent than other games of this type. I found it a lot easier to pick this one up. Because this is developed by Paradox, it has of course had major updates, and they always are very good at keeping their games well maintained. And I'm looking forward to playing this one for many hours to come. Next up is Orwell, and as you can probably tell from the title, this is a theme which is very close to my heart. It's about a 1984 style surveillance system that you, the player, are in control of. You may have seen similar games do this kind of simulation of an operating system. and it works really well here. Despite being based on the idea of you sitting at a desk at a computer, it does have some really tense moments where you kind of feel like you're against the clock. Using the software you can thwart terrorist attacks, track down killers, that kind of thing. Or you can even decide to kind of become the terrorist. Maybe you think that this kind of system doesn't belong in this world. It's all based on player choice, which I think will carry on through to episode 2 of Orwell, which will be coming to Steam soon, and I'm looking forward to playing it. Going into this, I really didn't think I'd enjoy this kind of simulation, and if it wasn't for the theme, I probably wouldn't have bothered, but I was very pleasantly surprised by this one. So check it out. Number 5 is Factorio, and this is one of those games that you can literally spend hundreds and hundreds of hours on, just playing in different ways, seeing all the different things you can do in the game. It's a sandbox where you're stuck on a planet, you're basically mining different materials and building up a factory so that you can eventually build a spaceship and get off the planet. This game reminded me of when I started playing Banished a few years ago, and I just could not put it down. You can spend a lot of time trying to figure out optimal ways of doing things and trying to build up the perfect factory. And it's also fun to just restart over and over again and try different random things and different ways of doing things. The developer of Factorio is absolutely great. This is possibly the best example of early access done right, because there are constant updates to the game and also very frequent developer diaries, with the developer telling us every little thing that they're working on and going really in depth into the complex mechanics of the game. Once again, I'm kind of a beginner at this stage, but this is one of those games that I hope to improve upon over time and put a lot of time into it if I get the chance. This game has a few sort of real-time strategy elements, so it's something that pretty much anyone that is a fan of sort of survival strategy or maybe even city building games should be able to enjoy. Number 4 is a real-time strategy game from 2001 called Hostile Waters: Anteus Rising. It's one of these sort of hybrid RTS games you might have seen before, where you have a tactical view, but then you can take direct control of units. But something that might surprise you for a game from 2001 is I was absolutely blown away by this game's AI. There's so many different commands you can give to your units, and to have them follow you in different ways and defend units and things like that, that you really have almost complete control of what's going on in the battlefield, more so than any other RTS game I've really played. And that does have something to do with the fact that you can pause the game at any time and go into this tactical view, which doesn't bode well for the multiplayer capabilities of the game, which unfortunately there is no multiplayer in this game. But as a single player experience, the campaign is actually really good. It's got a brilliant story, which is somewhat similar to Command & Conquer 3, which is my favourite Command & Conquer game. There's a fair few recognisable voice actors in here, and as the game goes on, it kind of subverts your expectations a lot in terms of where you think the story is heading, and for a real-time strategy game that is very rare. Though this game is of course quite dated, you can really see the potential here, and where RTS games should have gone from here, and how AI could really be utilised for the better in future RTS games. Other than the things I've mentioned, it kind of has everything you might expect from a real-time strategy game, but it's just interesting that a game from 2001 that I'd never heard of and just happened to stumble across just impressed me so much that I had to include it on this list. Number 3 is Yakuza 0. Now, this has recently become my favourite video game series of all time, and all of the reasons for that can of course be applied to this game. Every time you go into a new Yakuza game you think, wow, how can this game possibly be any bigger in scope or better than the previous game? There's just no possible way, and then it surprises you so much. And it's not as if the core gameplay is like wildly different or anything. The combat system has remained pretty similar since the beginning. but it's the way it introduces all these sort of side activities that just work side by side with the main core gameplay. And they are really just as important. And the brilliant thing about it is it's always to serve the story, which Yakuza has always had an incredibly deep story. And in my opinion, the best story that video games have ever told. Yakuza 0 being a prequel is set in 80s Japan, and that of course leads to some very interesting moments, and the humour is, as always in Yakuza, completely on point here. For a long time I've been frustrated that the Yakuza series hasn't had enough attention, because Yakuza 5 didn't even have a physical release in Europe because of this. But I've noticed a lot of YouTubers that I've been watching for years and years have suddenly started playing this series now because of Yakuza 0. And their thoughts were pretty much, wow, I can't believe I've never played this series, this is absolutely fantastic, and sort of nothing like I would ever expect it to be. The best way I can describe it is, if you've never played it, it is pretty much the Grand Theft Auto of Japanese gaming. So if you like the sound of that, then definitely check this series out, and Yakuza 0 is a great place to start. Number 2 is Nier Automata, and it's from my personal favourite game director, Yoko Taro. And similarly to Yakuza, a lot of people played this game and suddenly were like, oh wow, this game series is really good. It's part of the Drakengard series, which even if you've played this game, you might not even know that, and I can't blame you. This series has a very deep lore, and that's part of why I like it so much. I think the main draw of this game is how it manages to put the player into the shoes of the character by way of some really intriguing game mechanics surrounding the kind of functions of a cyborg in this post-apocalyptic world where humans don't really exist anymore. Despite this though, the way the story is handled, and this has been the case in every game in the series, the stakes could not feel higher. And what Yoko Taro does really well is just introduce a little splash of horror into his games, which accentuates that. The soundtrack is pure genius. There are sections in the game where you're kind of interfacing with mechanical things, and you go into a sort of top-down shooter mode, and the music goes all 8-bit, and that's another way that it kind of, immerses you in this idea of putting you into the character. Outside of that though, the orchestral score is possibly one of the most heartwarming, beautiful scores ever created for a video game. Despite the absolute desolation surrounding the characters, it has that little glimmer of hope, and I think that's drawn from the soundtrack. I was a little bit worried that Platinum Games would just screw this up completely because I'm not a fan of that studio. And to be honest, the combat is a little lifeless compared to other games. They tend to make their combat systems just insanely complex without any real rhyme or reason to it, and no way of sort of figuring out a purpose for all these different moves that you can do other than just being flashy. But I don't think that mattered in the end. I think the combat did what it needed to do in this particular game, and everything else about the game was just so beautiful, and I think I probably cried several times during this game. Nier Automata was certainly my game of the year, and I could talk endlessly about it, but for now, let's just leave it there. So the game that impressed me the most this year I played because I noticed a lot of people were playing and enjoying Divinity Original Sin 2, but I don't like to just jump into a game series at the most recent game without having played the previous games first. So I went back to one of Larian Studios' first games, Divine Divinity, and I'm happy to report that it absolutely blew me away. Now this is a pretty classic isometric RPG that at first glance you would think had a lot in common with Diablo and games like that. However, the more you play it, you start to realise that it has so much more depth than Diablo, especially in terms of story, which it does absolutely brilliantly, with just a dash of the humour that we've come to expect from Larian Studios. There's a lot of the kind of thing that people complain we don't get enough of in video games nowadays, in more recent games such as Skyrim. Things that make you feel like there's so much more options in terms of how you interact with characters and how you complete quests. And the best thing about it, I think, is that this game really doesn't hold your hand at all. It is quite difficult to get to grips with the UI and how it all works. But once you understand that, it's kind of you using your own logic to figure things out rather than following a quest marker or anything like that. In short, this game is very dated, but it's worth pushing through that to get to the juicy bits. Once you get past the first dungeon in this game, the world completely opens up, and it's a surprisingly large open world with lots of different villages, tons of stuff to explore. And for this type of game, I feel like the atmosphere is just second to none in Divine Divinity. On top of that, the atmosphere is bolstered by an amazing soundtrack that has shot straight into one of my top 5 favourite soundtracks of all time. It's sort of this really reverberous, epic score that really makes the world feel bigger than it actually is, even though it is quite big in the first place. I also played the follow-up to this, Beyond Divinity, and I'm currently playing Divinity 2, but so far hasn't really reached the heights of the first game. But from what I've heard, Divinity Original Sin is more of a return to form, and much more similar to the original, bringing back all those things that make RPGs so good and not dumbing them down so much, Bethesda. So those were my top 10 games of 2017 that I played. I'd love to know what games you played this year that you thought were really good. Please let us know in the comments below what you thought was Game of the Year 2017. I've been Jake of theretroperspective.com, and please subscribe if you enjoyed this video.